Hello to the saucy, the pert, and or the greasy. We are joined today by a beautiful voice for spiritual peace. Spiritual peace, two words you would think go together all the time, but that is not always the case. The important words of our guest, Ciarra Jones, however, are like a beacon of light in the stormy, soupy, watery seas of social media. Ciarra is a theologian who has deconstructed but maintained her faith and hopes to bring a more healthy and inclusive space to American church culture. We speak with her about horizontal versus vertical morality and how that may shape the decisions and moral centers of members of high control groups like the LDS Church, as well as how racism can become an underlying central virtue at the pulpit. Here is our interview with Ciarra. Like and sub if you enjoy it. It really helps us so much. And if you are listening and want to see our faces, you can head over to our baby YouTube channel at someplace underneath. Someplace underneath. The stuff that I hear sometimes, like I think you probably saw the notes. I was going through your content today just to for talking points, and you had recently broken down some of a sermon, and I got to tell you, it is hard to like. I felt my blood pressure just spiking, and I just can't understand how people can listen to that and think like feel spiritual about it or feel like healing or feel like something in their soul. The guy, it's so foreign to me. So I have a hard time, like, how do people get to that point? Like, how does that happen?
Absolutely. So something I talk about so much in my work, and the video that Natalie's referring to, I was breaking down a sermon where a pastor it was called "How to Vote Like Jesus," and I think the church is Lake Point Church, and they're a pretty big mega church. And he had broken it down through like border policy, immigration, I think biological sex, the family, and something else. And he had broken it down in a way to say, like, basically, in all these areas, you need to vote conservative. And something that I think we kind of lose sight of within the evangelical church is how God is constructed. So I grew up Pentecostal Assemblies of God, very indoctrinated into conservative theological ideology. And when I was like thinking, or when I was thinking about things like sexuality, or I was being told like, homosexuality is wrong. If I said that to a queer person, in my mind, when I was really indoctrinated, I thought I was loving this person. I thought this theology is me saving this person from damnation. This theology is me saving this world for Jesus. So when we see conservatives voting and they're saying, like, I'm going to be pro-life, and you can't really reach them to think about like what are the real systemic implications of reducing women's and people with wombs access to biological and reproductive care. They're not thinking about the worldly, corporeal, material impact of this theology. They're thinking, by me denying humanity's needs and voting for what God calls for, I am being righteous. I am being holy. I am being kind in this own type of weird theological way. So I think we have to remember that when people are indoctrinated in these theologies, they're seeing the world through the prism of these constructions, which means what looks like evil to us does feel like righteousness to them. And that's why I think for me, a lot of my work is how do I change how people understand God? Because then I can change how their civic engagement comes about.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, politics and religion, they used to not intermingle at all. And I'd say around the 40s or 50s, they did.
Yes.
Why do you think there was such a leap towards mingling, like preachers telling their congregation who you should vote for?
Well, I think I'll push back a little bit in a positive way.
Okay.
That we didn't see that intermingling of religion and politics until the 40s, religion and politics, right? Because even if I think about the founding of the United States, like Manifest Destiny and the colonization of America was founded in this idea that God called Protestant white people to colonize America from sea to shining sea.
Right.
And so I think there was always this kind of subtle idea that God ordained America to be this unique, special, white, hallowed ground where white people in particular are closer to God, have more claims to spiritual authority and spiritual ownership. And so, even looking at slavery as a political or social institution, what undergirded that was that like white people were closer to God theologically and black people were cursed theologically. We call this the Hamitic myth. And so I think there were always this kind of this undergirding like tone of religiosity within American
Yeah.
policy and our structures. But I think what happened in the 40s and 50s is like the conservative party was able to grab a particular claim to God. They were able to say, God not only blesses America, God blesses our idea of God specifically. And so I do think we see that shift a little bit to like like God being for all of white America, to God being in particular on the side of conservative white evangelicals. And I'm not sure exactly what precipitated that shift, but I do think there was this understanding that if the conservative party aligns itself with this ideology, they're able to grab those Sunday voters, you know, and I think that understanding that reaching a religious base also is tied to maintaining religious power, I think really comes through in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
But I want to say we've always had this conversation between politics and race and religion throughout American history.
Yeah, and as you know, we're covering specifically the Mormon Church. Which
Yes.
you're not specifically a Mormon theologian,
No.
but it's a part of your world, and
Yeah.
they very specifically became a church during the foundation of the U.S. moving into the western part of this country, and they actually are so ingrained in the idea of wealthy white Jesus. In a way that I don't think people necessarily fully understand if they're not aware of, like, that's when that I certainly wasn't, that this church started as America was starting. Like Utah became a state while the Mormons were also kind of trying to develop their own country inside of it, and they kind of came to an agreement. I think my question in that is, if the entire premise of the religion is this idea of a rich white Jesus, rich white American Jesus, like, how can it be a healthy space, I guess?
That's a really good question. So one, I want to say something we say in religion, just to break it down for your audience, is that race and religion are co-constructed, or they also call it the constellation of race and religion. And by that, as I talked about from Manifest Destiny to slavery, there's this idea that as the idea of white, like the white race was formed within a United States context, it was also tied to, as I mentioned, claims to religious power. And something I say all the time in my work is that, like, in some ways within the United States context, white people created systemic inequality, then they called it God. They said, like, we have more economic power because God blesses us, without an acknowledgement of, well, there's also been systems that have been set up through Jim Crow law, through black codes, through segregation that have allowed you all to hoard resources. Or white people are more educated because they try harder or they're more blessed. But actually, what does it mean when one community has more educational access? So I want to say, I think in some ways we see white evangelicals, white Mormons cling to this idea of a white rich Jesus or white rich God, because if God is on the side of the white and the wealthy and rich, then white people have no atonement to make for systemic inequality. It's just how God ordered the world. And so I want to say, I think part of the reason these theologies are constructed this way is to allow, I think, white communities to circumvent a sense of responsibility for the genuine state of the world. Yeah. And so the question is, you know, how could these theologies be healthy? Well, when we look at it through the lens of marginalized communities, we're like, this cannot be healthy, this cannot be safe. But if you look at it through the lens of a white, wealthy individual, this theology feels healthy because it makes me impervious to self-reflexivity. It makes me impervious to having to grieve and empathize with the world. So I think it probably feels healthy to exist in a theology that co-signs your very existence and that says, in your existence, you are chronically and always right. I imagine that feels really wonderful. I think for the rest of us, we look at it and we're like, this cannot be right. And I think in my work, I do, because I was fundamentalist, I see it through both perspectives, a perspective of the person who believes this theology is good, and then the perspective of all of us who are suffering on the other side of it as well.
So this seems like it's sort of connected to what you've already spoken about, and I see more of this conversation happening online, which I think is great, is this idea of horizontal versus vertical morality.
Yeah.
And you've made some great content about that Could you possibly just do like a brief explanation of what that means?
Yes, absolutely. So long ago, or a month ago, I stitched a video from Rachel Kane about horizontal versus vertical reality and or morality and authority. And I'm not gonna lie that I actually didn't respond to that exact thing because I'm not sure which one is which, like as I'm about to explain it. So I just want to say how I understand the church's
Yeah,
authority, and then you all can tell me if that's horizontal or vertical because I've actually never used that exact language.
totally.
So I want to own what I do know and what I don't know. But I think in general, we have to realize within church structures, like something Rachel opens up her video with saying is they don't care about the world's salvation because they don't care about your damnation. And something that I think about like chronically as we think about policy and faith and religion and harm and inequality and marginalization is, when you are in these church structures, you're taught to see individual suffering as, or you start to see suffering as brought about by individuals' failures and sin, not by anything that's happening systemically. And you're going to vote as your pastor tells you to vote because that feels like that's how you're going to access heaven. And so, something that Rachel says in her work again is that they don't care about our damnation because they feel that it's our fault that we're living in sin, that if we were living on the side of what is righteous, then we wouldn't suffer as well. So, when you're living in this world, but you feel like this world is a test for you to inherit heaven, you feel a lot less concerned with the everyday person and what's happening for them. And so something someone had commented on the video that you're referencing, Natalie, is you don't want to be so like heavenly minded that you're no earthly good. And I love that. And I think that's kind of where our theologies are heading, that they're so focused on the ethereal, what is above the world, that there's actually a lack of concern and empathy for the person who's suffering here. So I don't know if that's vertical and horizontal reality. You can clarify that for your audience, but that's kind of the video that you're referencing what I was talking about in that video.
Yeah.
Well, something the church does that I think is kind of clever is they say, like, the suffering you have on earth, that you're supposed to suffer on earth. So then they do go and vote against their own interests. And it's almost like a good thing that they can't put groceries
Like
on their
they're
table.
Sacrificing or something.
Yeah.
Yes,
Because then you'll be
absolutely,
rewarded in
absolutely.
heaven.
And I think to clarify, I think I think now as I process it, like that vertical authority or vertical morality is like when you're kind of only in service to a higher power.
Yes.
Whereas horizontal when we have empathy for our neighbor.
Yeah,
Like
the people
churches-
around us. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So churches are constructed in that vertical way. And
Yeah.
what I want your audience to understand is part of that is like when I was fundamentalist, I was always told like you are in the world and not of it. And that does literally change your understanding of your responsibility to your neighbor. Like when you feel like, well, my neighbor is in the world and they're doing worldly things, but I am like a heavenly minded person. Like it does, I think, almost create a type of spiritual narcissism or even a type of religious psychosis where you kind of stop seeing the person around you as fully human and fully valuable. And I think, especially when I was fundamentalist, I was taught to really only form relationships with non-Christians to evangelize them. So if your relationship with another is to only bring them into your worldview and your perspective, you do lose so much around human connection and reciprocal learning and understanding.
How do you reach somebody who, for example, in Mormonism, are told that they will become gods? Well, the men will. The women will have to have their children for eternity, which sounds horrible. But they are told if you do all of the things we're telling you, if you give us 10% of your income for your entire life forever, you're going to have your own planet. You're going to be a god somewhere else. How do you reach somebody who's in that mindset to say, we need you here to be a citizen with us on this planet. We don't know what happens afterwards. I'm probably going to guess you don't get a planet, but I'm not going to say that because they wouldn't react to that.
That's got to be really hard to tell somebody who, like, that would be like, if I was a guy, I'd be like, yeah, I get my own planet. Duh, bye,
Yeah, I'm going to say right now, if I'm getting my own planet, I'm leaving all behind. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think that, one, is very enticing, as you both mentioned, to feel like your theology is going to get you your own planet. And kind of the through line within Protestant Christianity is like, I've been to churches that told me, like, if I serve God, when I go to heaven, like, I'll have my own Starbucks in my house. I'll have I've had these theologies said to me, like, if you serve God, like I've had pastors say, like, in heaven, like, you wake up and you just say, like, I want a burrito, and like it appears in front of you. Like, I've had pastors really like paint this really interesting, deep, detailed picture of heaven as a way to tie their theology. So I think that's the connection between Mormonism and Christianity. So I
Wow.
guess I inherit a mansion and you'll inherit a planet. But I think, one thing I will say is like when we talk about this process of getting people to think differently theologically, the word we use for that is religious deconstruction. And religious deconstruction is a critical evaluation of what we know, think, and believe. And many of us are told when you grow up in a fundamentalist way that the theology you're given is immutable. And to question that theology is to question God. To question the authority of your pastor is to question God. So I name all that just to say, especially if you're someone who is atheist or agnostic already, it's so easy to look at these theologies and be like, this is a little bit wild. Like, why would someone believe this? But I do encourage people to empathize with what it means to live in this theology, to believe that thinking another way literally threatens your physical safety and the safety of your soul. So it took me 10 years to deconstruct, and I think it can take a lot of people that long. For me, the impetus was my sexuality because realizing I was queer threw me into opposition of my own theology. And I had to ask myself, do I want to live a lifetime of oppressing myself for this theology, or do I want to run the risk of living freely and allowing whatever happens to me to happen to me? And I decided living hell on earth was much more terrifying for me than living in service to a hell that may never exist or never come. Like that felt scarier to me. So I name all that to say it can be a long process. I find that you have to have a very gentle entry point for people. And when I want someone to deconstruct or maybe change theologically, I start with gentle questions. For example, I might ask someone, have you ever experienced God differently than your pastor has said God exists? Or have you ever had an experience theologically that challenged something that you have been told within church? Like really gentle questioning. One of my favorite questions that I am Christian Smith asks, he's another progressive theologian, is he says like to people, how do you think people experience God before biblical text or before the sacred text you were given? Like what values would you assign to God if you didn't have a text in front of you? And so I find if you're trying to really bring someone into deconstruction, it's remembering that they're terrified of thinking a different way. And you do kind of have to gently bring them into a fold of thinking in new ways about the world around them. And that can be a long process. And it's both a personal process and a collective process. I know I said a lot, so let me pause there.
No, that makes complete sense. I get sometimes so cynical about it and following some of the people who are like very public voices in the church, who are maybe like social media people, because Mormonism is huge in social media sphere. I get into a mindset of being like, this is bullshit and you don't care because you're comfortable and you are given all of these things. And I think I'm being overly cynical, but I also think that it's the danger of it sometimes is fostering the idea. I would like to think that if you were given the keys to everything, like the men for specifically in a lot of churches are like considered the like little lords, but not every man looks at that and goes, I love this. If I was given free reign, I would just want to dominate everyone and impregnate all these people and do this. There's like people have compassion and empathy in them. Some of them do enough to like see, even though I have this privilege here, this is not what I want. It's just to like force my hand and like do all of this like domination stuff. I feel like that mentality can sort of permeate inside of those spaces, especially I see some of it with Mormonism, but I really appreciate your perspective because it's much more compassionate, and I'm trying to find that space to be less judgmental.
I mean, something I will say is I'm about to be 31 this month. It's my birthday month, and
nice. Sagittarius, right?
Thank you. I've been deconstructing since I was 19, so I have been through a lot over those about 11 years of like. I've been agnostic. I've been atheist over those years. I've walked like my whole home church voted for Trump in 2016. I grew up Assemblies of God, and I was angry. If you all look back at my 2016 Facebook, I was yelling at people, theological arguments. Yeah. Old pastor was calling me a demon and a heretic. Like it's all there,
no.
So I think I want to say like I have been deeply angry at the church. I have been deeply upset at the church. I felt frustrated. I felt abandoned, especially as a Black woman. And who grew up in Assemblies of God is a white denomination, but my church was very diverse. So I was really shocked to see how they voted. And so I name all that to say, like, I can only be compassionate now because I was angry then. Like, there has to be a rage period. I think rage is clearing, it is cleansing. And the reason I came back into this work is because when I realized I was queer, like I really suffered. I mean, I really prayed away the gay. I really suffered in my body every day for months, maybe even a couple of years, trying to find myself theologically and trying to trust that God does love me and receive me after hearing theologies for years that said God could never love me or that I was demonic or bad. And so I want to say, yeah, I'm compassionate now because I was angry then. But also, I mean, the biggest reason I do this work is to reach other LGBTQ people who are stuck in these theologies. I know I won't reach everyone with this work. I sometimes get overrun with comments around how my work is, anti-Christ. I get those things too. But I really do this work to reach those who I know are suffering in these theological constructions, but stay because they're told this is the only way to be. And something I say in my work is religion is a social determinant of health. So we can't just tell people to leave it and give them nowhere to go because people they'll have mental health crises, they'll feel lonely. So I want to say thank you for the recognition of the compassion, but I also want to acknowledge it was hard fought compassion. And if you are, listening to this and you're deconstructing and you're angry or you're looking at the world circumstance and you're angry, that's okay too. I think that's an important process to get to a more compassionate experience.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I want to also, I want to come back to talking about how to speak with people in the church or try to, create a better church space. But before that, I was very curious about your experiences. Is it common outside of Mormonism to have prophets who in evangelical, do they have prophets at that level, like a living prophet who speaks directly to God and talks down to the church about what God says?
Like you can contact him on Facebook right now.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Well, we've had there was a prophet that I just actually looked up before our podcast. Can't remember the name now, but there's actually was a female prophet. I think her name was Amy Carlson. Years ago, she believed she was Jesus and she ran a cult. It was called Love on War or something like that years ago. So I want to say we've even had women prophets that have believed they were Jesus or God reincarnated. And a lot of cults throughout the U.S. history have believed that the leader was somehow uniquely connected to God. But with evangelical culture, we see kind of this prophet idea mostly through revival culture. Have you all been to a revival? You know what revivals are? Okay.
I haven't.
Yeah, they're very intense.
They're really intense. So I think a good example of a revival, when you all are listening, if you have seen Dune 2, there's a scene where Timothée Chalamet goes into a room of people who are religious zealots kind of, and he starts looking at them and he'll start saying to them I can see your dreams, you dreamed of your grandmother last night, or you I've been to revivals where I see similar things. Pastors will go on stage and they'll point at someone and be like, you have knee pain and come up here and get healed for your knee pain, or last night, God, I saw you in my dream and God says you are blessed, and God says so there are ways that within revival culture, pastors come on stage as a direct conduit from heaven to that audience. And they speak as if God is directly being channeled through their voice. So I think it's very common that we see this in evangelical culture. And something that I always know is it can usually be something very generic. Someone in this audience has cancer, or somebody in this audience is going through divorce, and people feel oh my goodness, this person is directly tied to God. Also within the Assemblies of God Church and just within Pentecostalism broadly, we believe in something, or they believe in something called gifts of the Spirit. And one of those is prophecy, the ability to kind of see into the future or know what's coming. And another one is speaking in tongues. And fundamentalists believe if someone speaks in tongues, someone needs to translate it. So when I was a kid being in church, someone would literally in the middle of my service, someone would speak in tongues, and then my pastor would stop and say, she is saying this, or he is saying this. And so you kind of have this direct line again from pastor to God. And so it might not be the pastor saying I'm God himself or themselves or herself, but there are these moments where pastors literally become this prophetic conduit for the Spirit of God in these ways.
Mormonism calls it power of discernment. And they have definitely, all of the bishops in Mormonism say they speak with God, but there's a top guy. Every time he dies, he gets replaced. So they have a living prophet at the very, very tip top of the church called the president. And right now, the guy who's the president is 100 years old. He is
He looks like the crypt keeper.
He does.
Yeah.
And this is no like ageism thing here, but like 100 years old, you don't know what's going on. Like you need to be sitting somewhere cozy with a Werther's original, not just like leading people in spirit.
Well, especially because they do sometimes create scripture. So there was one in 95 that the president slash prophet of the church, he made this thing called the Family Proclamation, and it basically said, God told me that women are supposed to stay home, not work anymore, create more children. And it was made into scripture inside of the church by this man. And a lot of women we've spoken to, it was a turning point where they basically became living in servitude of their husbands. They took their names off of checking accounts. They stopped, a lot of Mormons are small business owners, and they were taken off of like the LLC as a name because the prophet said, I spoke to God and he said this. And the whole church went like, okay, and they did it. Is that unique in the sense of there is this one guy at the very tip top? Because it feels like a corporation almost. But is it maybe that, I don't know. Do you see that as different at all as from the other churches that you've seen?
Yeah, like when I talk about like revival culture and stuff, is that a bit different than like kind of this literal authority figure that can make people change their whole lives? I think yes and no. I think that like when I see, as we talked about in the beginning, that sermon of the pastor telling people how to vote, I do see that as a pastor acting in like a prophetic way, because they're saying like literally when you're saying how to vote like Jesus, you're telling me you have a direct line to Jesus to understand how Jesus would feel politically in this moment. And I understand people can say, well, we're using biblical context to draw these conclusions. But I think there is this way this person is saying, I'm close enough to Jesus to know Jesus's literal will and literal heart 2,000 years after Jesus' passing. But I do think there can be, within Mormonism, it does seem like, and I want to honor, I'm not a scholar of this area, but just as you describe it, it does seem like pastors might have a little more authority in people's day-to-day life choices. Is that pretty common in Mormonism that, pastors control that, like these minor aspects?
They're called bishops, but it's, they,
yeah, and it's like mandatory 10% of their income is given to the church.
Oh,
and like,
wow.
I know.
Yeah, they can't, they're not in good standing if they don't. They actually keep track of all of their finances, and then they have meetings if they haven't given enough. And then they can't go to the temple if they haven't paid all of it.
I mean, we just had an offering plate, and I would like put in some money, but it wasn't like, how much did you put in? I know your bank account. I know where you work. Like Mormonism is very connected to day-to-day life.
Very connected to finances as well.
Finances.
Yes.
Wow. Yeah. See, I have not been, at least I'm sure there are Protestant Christians that have been in churches that are that level of high control. I have not. I think that the way Protestant churches do it is through a lot of shame, like theological, spiritual shame. And like my church, when they did tithing back in the day, it would be like, we need a new roof, and the new roof costs like $200,000. And like every week they would kind of count it up and be like, and have like maybe like a thermometer that they're filling in on like the wall. And like, it'll kind of show us where we are as a church, what's been given. And so they do try to incentivize you to give in this way, or they always give you this speech before tithing of the way God will like make your life more bountiful if you charge or if you tithe. And so a lot of progressive pastors, even within the Protestant church, do talk about tithing and financial abuse. And pastors will say pretty biting things from the pulpit about what it means about you if you're a congregant who does not give, but they still don't have insight into your actual literal finances that I've seen in the way that you're describing Mormonism, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot. I don't want to I'm trying really hard not to disrespect people. We've had a couple active members come and speak who are trying to be progressive inside the church, which is incredibly difficult. So I don't want to be super insulting, but I do think that seems unhealthy. The Mormon Church has about $250 billion, and they own land, they own a mall, and a lot of the tithing goes to their investments. And so I do think that There's no question. I think that's immoral. But it is also part of their religion that they can't go to the highest place you can get into unless you pay them enough money.
Wow. That reminds me a bit of, it sounds very Scientology.
Oh, it is. It's very
okay.
similar. Yeah.
I'm like, it's giving Leah Remini because I watch her show.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. But I will say a through line is this fear of financial abuse. And I think in particular, what we see in evangelical and Pentecostal churches is I feel this abuse of lower income congregants and kind of basically engaging in this financial magical thinking of if you give to our church, you'll be economically blessed. And I do think it is lower income, poor congregants who are most harmed by that rhetoric because in desperation, they are going to give their last $20 to the church. But what does it mean when many of our evangelical Protestant churches that are very wealthy, they don't engage in creating equal housing for their congregants.
No.
Even something I think about all the time is when there was a huge hurricane in Texas and like Joel Osteen wouldn't house anyone within his church. So I think something that does concern me within the Protestant church is this kind of financial abuse of congregants through the prosperity gospel.
Prosperity gospel, right? And they don't. I don't think Mormonism is connected to that a lot of the time, but it kind of is.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're so closed off. I feel like prosperity gospel. Maybe would you consider that more stuff like televangelism, things that like everybody can access?
Yes, absolutely. Joel Osteen's a big prosperity, and I'm not gonna lie. When I was younger, I liked a lot of his sermons. They're really accessible and they feel really easy. They're really good, like lessons for the week, and they are still rooted in this idea of like the more that you give to God or the more you show up for God, the more like this certain level of abundance will overflow in your life. And again, that can come through tithing and other ways. So it is, televangelist is a good example of prosperity gospel. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think the difference with Mormonism is that it is like Scientology, a closed off. You need to, if you pay in, you have to go into this, like the temple, for example. Not all Mormons get to go into the temple. They have normal churches, and then the temple is when you've done all your stuff, you get a recommend, and then you can go inside this, like their temples. I'm sure you've seen, they look like castles. They are massive, and they have, $50,000 chandeliers inside all the stuff. And that's where you go when you have done all of the things you're supposed to do. But for example, a woman that we spoke to, she's named Jenny Gage. She does a lot of social media stuff, but she figured out that her and her ex-husband had given around $300,000 to the church over their marriage. And that even though she was getting married inside of the temple, which is the big thing, like the most important thing is in Mormonism is to get married inside the temple, be able to be in good standing. But only other good standing members can see you get married inside. And her parents, who were very loyal Mormons, were behind on tithing. And so they could not witness her marriage.
Wow.
I wonder what the psychological damage is of there's constantly this new level that's this super secret thing that we're not going to tell you about because
another Scientology similarity.
Similarity, because I know in Southern Baptism it was always like, oh, you believe in God, we're in, right?
Yes.
But it seems like this another level, like I would be anxious all the time. Like psychologically, if it's like, did I do enough? Am I right? Am I in good standing? I don't know.
Well, it's probably a way to, keep you in potentially, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have a question back to you all, which is how do you feel like that structure within Mormonism impacts? Yeah, how does it impact familial relationships or people's relationships?
Not well.
Yeah.
It really because basically, if you get excommunicated, you're considered like an apostate. You can't. They don't go as far as Jehovah's Witnesses necessarily, but the idea is deeply implanted in you that you shouldn't be speaking to people who aren't in good standing with the church. Yes. So a lot of families are very much ripped apart.
That's cult behavior, to be honest.
Yes, it is
it's
cult
mean
behavior.
to say,
and I think there are ways that we do see this come into Protestant Christianity. I think, and there's some parallels. Like one, I think about how many Christians have a queer friend or a queer family member and won't go to their wedding, period, because going to their wedding challenges their own like sense of faith standing, or they feel like if they go, they are co-signing something that is spiritually sinful. So I do still see these theologies kind of tear families apart, but it's less prescriptive. It's just because the pastor has preached this thing over time, I'm also going to make sure my life stays theologically clean by not engaging with queer people or trans people or whatever it is. So I've seen it impact families in that way. I think something that I also think about when you all talk about this within the Mormon church is volunteer culture within the Protestant church. So even though, like, yes, like as you mentioned within Southern Baptism or Pentecostalism or evangelicalism, there is this idea, come one, come all, everyone is welcome, come as you are, which of course is language to get people in the door, but it is not come as you are. Like there are standards of theological practice they'd like you to maintain, or spiritual practice. But like I've seen, like, if you all watch the Hillsong United documentary, something people talk about so much is how much they volunteered at that church for free. Sweeping the floors, not getting paid, working long hours, 12, 14 hours at the church, not getting paid, because you're trying to work to get into better favor with God, to show your commitment and good favor with your pastors. And the language that's used in Protestant churches around volunteers is like, the person sweeping the floor is as important as the pastor. And if you're dedicated to sweeping the floor, like you're going to like move up throughout the ranks, God is going to bless you. And so I think that language of like blessing the servant is really used within Protestant culture. And like people almost move into this like servanthood or servitude kind of place so that they can like show the pastor that they're loyal and show God they're loyal. And I think that's how churches extract a lot of free labor and engage in a lot of spiritual abuse. Like something that shook me in the Hillsong United documentary is, Hillsong United started in Australia and they started planting churches here.
Yeah.
And they would bring in head pastors from Australia to come lead churches here and more junior pastors. Every junior pastor and their wives, the junior pastor's wife would be the nanny for the head pastor. So they were kind of creating this like childcare, to me, multi-level marketing scheme around, and then one pastor had an affair with the junior level nanny, and then his wife punched that nanny, and like the church did not address that.
No,
like
it's not
a lot
funny.
happened. So in churches, I don't see within Protestant culture like this expressed hierarchy, but through volunteer culture, and there is this manipulation and extraction of church people, their labor and their money and time.
Yeah, it's almost like there's similarities there, but Mormonism has made it more corporate.
Yes.
Like they put handbooks together, really. And it's probably not going to surprise you to know that Utah voted almost unanimously for Trump. Utah, Idaho, Arizona, all the areas that are really thick Mormonism, there's like, I think stats say there's like maybe 10% of active Mormons who recognize as progressive. They also they're very intermeshed in politics in ways that people probably don't understand. There's a lot of Mormons inside of the government. And they've also been really integral in, made sure that gay people can't get married, things like that. They're very anti-LGBTQ. Do you think why do you think that churches are so anti-LGBTQ?
That's a really, really good question. Actually, I'm trying to look for the book right now. But one of my favorite pastors, Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, she wrote this book called Fierce Love. And something I'm going to talk about when we talk again about kind of changing minds theologically is a fellowship I run within Black churches around queer inclusion. But something she says in her work all the time is like, we engage in small and large ways in gatekeeping God. She says some of that is to inflate our own spiritual ego. Like, what does it do for me if I say to both of you, like, God loves me and doesn't love you? That does something for my sense of self-esteem, I think, or my sense of spiritual ego, that I have access and I matter more to some divine entity. And I think also in the same way, like, I think God becomes a power structure just like anything else. I think in the same way, we make it harder for women to become CEOs in corporate America or Black folks to get hired into tech. We do the same thing with God. We say for certain people, there is another hoop you need to jump through to be good enough in this space. And so for me, I think it's about a maintenance of power and authority. And I think in the same way in corporate America, we maintain a structure that's very patriarchal that makes it difficult for women to come up into corporate spaces. I think we do that in the same way in the church. We do it most violently to LGBTQ people, but I don't know, Mormonism, if women can be pastors, many Assemblies of God churches, still don't ordain women.
Extremely patriarchal.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. Many Christian churches, no matter what denomination, do not ordain women, or women can only be women's ministers or children's ministers. So I really think it's about maintaining a systemic inequality around God. When we say only a certain people get into heaven, we're doing something systemically about saying who matters spiritually. And I find Christians are most angry at me in my content when I say queer people matter to God too, because for them, I think the real deep question is, well, why am I doing all of this? Why am I
Yeah.
suffering theologically if God loves everyone? And so I do think there's also this kind of frustration for Christians. If you say God loves everyone, then it's like, well, I'm suffering for God and you're not suffering for God. You get to be who you are. I don't get to be who I am. So I think it's also like this feeling of like, I've repressed myself for a whole lifetime. Like, you don't get to be who you are authentically and claim this God. You need to suffer like I've suffered. And so I think in many ways you said what makes God rigorous is suffering to get to God. When actually for me, I think in a world that tells all of us we're not good enough as we are, a God that loves all of us as we are is the most profound God we could construct, actually.
I
But
love
anyway, I
that.
want to say I think it's mostly about power and authority and maintaining God as its own systemic structure, I think.
Yeah, I definitely think that that is very prevalent in the Mormon church is the idea that the more that you are giving away of yourself, the more likely you're going to get to the high. There's three levels of heaven in Mormonism. So the celestial kingdom is the highest one. And so you're always aiming. So you can also get into like, it is very much corporatized again, because it's like, you can be pretty good and you can get into the celestial kingdom, but don't you want to get into the celestial kingdom? And if you really want to do that, you got to do this, 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 this. And it's very oppressive. It's very constricting. And it is very much based around how many children you can have. That's another big one. But yes, it is extremely patriarchal. And actually, Mormonism, the temple wedding, the thing that you should do over anything else, just recently changed. It used to be that when you did the temple marriage, and this is very secretive, we've only known it now from Mormons who've left and want to reveal these things, but the husband used to take a vow to God, and the wife used to take a vow to the husband until very recently. So she
Wow.
gave herself over to the husband essentially in the marriage.
Wow. And the husband is seen as like is divorce common in Mormonism then because of
No,
this? I mean, no.
no,
No.
Okay. Yeah.
they very much encourage you, especially even if your spouse is very violent. If they've left the church, they even encourage you to stay more, because then you
Mm,
need to bring them back in. You need to help
yes.
them.
As you were talking, I was looking to see if I could find one of my favorite books in the world is God is a Black Woman, which I know I have a little thing she can't see it. And it's something she connects is like a white male God to all other forms of systemic inequality we see. Like she calls him like the God of locker room talk and the God of the all white
Mm.
male boardroom and the God of economic inequality. And so I want to say, like, again, like when we do make God uniquely concerned for men, we are saying necessarily God ordered the world where men need to be in authority and power. And so I think the church does understand that it's connected to every other structure. And by doing this, like there's a maintenance of power in corporate America, there's a maintenance of power in higher education. Like we can't disconnect how the church constructs power and authority from how we all experience power and authority in secular spaces too. So I want to just put that out there because I think sometimes, and something I feel frustrated with sometimes when I talk to my friends that are like more secular progressives is they throw out religion as an analytical framework to understand how power works in the world. But I don't think we can understand power without religion. So I think that's really interesting. And I'll say, even in the Christian church, though, we don't, it's not as prescribed that men are in charge like this. There is this way that women are taught to suffer in their marriages and are taught that if you're suffering in that marriage, it's because you're being like that is your devotion to God. Like you're in charge of like upholding this man and uplifting this man. And if you're not doing that, or if you walk away from this marriage or the marriage fails, it's on the woman's spiritual prowess, not on the man's spiritual commitment, which I think is kind of interesting.
Interesting. What's that book called again?
God is a Black Woman. I know I can't show you all because of the thing, but it's really, really good.
I'll give it
Dr.
a read.
Cleveland, I'm a super fan of hers. But something she also says in this book that I love is imagination is theology, and our culture hasn't given us much space to imagine a non-white, non-male God. And I just love
Right.
that phrase,
Yes.
imagination is theology, because it reminds us, like, again, something that I think probably the Mormon church would say and the Protestant church says is like, we are this way because God is. But she reminds us like God is because this is how we've constructed God, not because this is a stagnant, immutable definition of God. And so I really love her work because of that.
Nice.
That's so beautiful, and it is such a big reminder, because I think in America we're so conditioned to this kind of religion, Christianity, that I never connected to imagination. I grew up secularly, so it's so foreign to me anyway, but like that's such a beautiful way to think about it, and that makes sense why spiritualism is important. I sometimes struggle to understand because I don't understand that kind of like patriarchal church. It doesn't compute because I never grew up in it, but like that makes me understand spiritualism a lot more. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. So I'm looking at the world and also America is moving more far right and very religious. And as someone who, as yourself is deconstructed, mine also, how would you tell people how to deal with it, I guess, or how to cope, or how to live and not be so like stressed and bummed out? Because I get so anxious and scared, and like, how do I stop that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Like, I want to say, like, I am scared with y'all. So I think I understand.
No, you have to help us. I'm just kidding.
No, I'm like, well, we gotta call someone else. I'm just kidding. Phone a friend on this podcast. But no, I think like one, I want to say, like, I also feel that fear. Something that James Baldwin and Angela Davis both talk about is like, one, James Baldwin always says like, something he says is like, love has never been a popular movement. He talks about this a lot in his work. And I've been thinking about that now. Like, what does love look like for me in this moment? And deep compassion for myself and the others who are in community with me. I name that because I don't always believe we have to have compassion for folks that have harmed us politically or socially. I think we can if that's our spiritual practice. But I don't always feel that for folks who have voted for Trump or have created what I consider to be a political hellscape for many of us. So I want to say, like, I'm not asking folks to do that. But for me, I do think, as I mentioned, like rage is cleansing. So if you're sad, if you're angry, if you feel rage, allow yourself to feel that. Go to a rage room, journal about it, journal about it, light it on fire if you need to, like whatever you need to do to cleanse that rage and to acknowledge it, please do it. But something that I do feel like I did in my own deconstruction journey, which maybe is helpful to talk about here, is there was a time in my deconstruction journey where I deconstructed to the point of nihilism. Like I just felt like nothing is here and nothing matters. And I think it's easy in this political moment to feel that way too. And something that I've found lately in running a lot of workshops through my consulting firm is just the gift of one-to-one connection. Like it means something to me if I have a workshop and it had two people and one person says like being in connection with you or community with you changed my day to day, or being able to talk about this changed my day. And so I guess what I'm trying to tell people is when the state of the world feels too overwhelming and too tragic, what are the one-to-one human connections in your life that are life-giving? What is a friend you can call, the family member you can call, the person you go to lunch with, the person you go on a walk with, that grounds you in your sense of worthiness and your sense of connection and your sense of being connected to the humanity around you? Because for me right now, one-to-one connection with Black women in particular has been my saving grace. Being with a community that loves me and sees me, who I grieve alongside, has really healed me. Yeah. So I think when we feel this loneliness, when we feel this anger, for me, the answer is always dropping into connection. And so I wonder what that looks like, for folks.
What advice do you have for trying to reach people who you have a hard time understanding because they are perhaps on a more vertical morality train? Like, how do you reach people in that space? Like, you said gentle questions, which I loved. Yes. That's very good. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I'll say that I think actually is like very counterintuitive now in our social media world is that like theological change is actually a grassroots movement. Yes, we do it. I do a lot through social media. You all are doing it through social media, and we can touch a lot of lives that way. But it is one-to-one work. So something I want to shout out is I work for an organization called Pride in the Pews. And through them, I run a fellowship called the Black Church Equality Fellowship. And we're looking to change how Black churches feel about queer inclusion within their churches. So we're literally trying to change how they teach their theology. Years ago when I was at Harvard, I had a chance to work on a project with a pastor, Reverend Brandon Crowley, who he just wrote a book from this research not too long ago. We interviewed Black pastors and we said, why do you preach this theology? Like, why will you preach a queer inclusive theology? And they said, well, can you teach me how to maintain my members if I change my theology? Because if I preach that God loves gay people, maybe 100 members leave, and like that's my tithing for the month. And we realized in doing all this interviewing that a lot of pastors wanted to preach something different, but they were afraid of their denomination. They were afraid of the impact of their congregation. They didn't know how to introduce a new theology. So through Pride in the Pews and through this fellowship, we gather Black pastors together and we bring them through a whole process. We teach them all about progressive theology. We teach them how to implement it into their churches. We monitor their church's progress. We assess how their churches have changed. And so I name all this to say, like, I think the movement of theological change is a grassroots process where it's people like you and me and all of us coming together, reaching into these churches and saying, how can we support a theological change for you? What does this look like? And that changes congregants' minds, which is beautiful. And then for the people in our life that are thinking a certain way theologically, as I mentioned, this gentle questioning. It's also, I think, telling them like, hey, I think you think this theology is righteous and good. The way you believe actually drives, I love you, and this drives a separation between us. Can we talk about that? Can we talk about how this theology is literally harmful to my well-being and the people that I love and care about, and talk about why you maintain this theological ideology? And so I find that it's helpful to say to people like, what you are preaching is harming me. I actually think it does help people think like, let me think about this a bit more. Because as I mentioned, a lot of Christians are taught they are on the side of righteousness. And I think do want to be empathetic. And I think when you say to people like straight up, like this theology is very harmful for me, it's helpful. But I just want to remind folks, I do think this is a grassroots, slow movement. And it's through conversation, like over time, that it does it, that there's something that changes. Like, I know I've talked a lot, but I want to say one thing, which is when I was 16, I think it was the first time I kind of realized I was queer. And there was a queer girl in my high school who like had kind of hit on me a couple times, y'all. And I was like, no, like I love Jesus. What is this? And like years later, like when I realized I was queer, I reached out to her and I was like, yo, sorry when you hit on me when I was like 16, I said I love Jesus. That was trash. And like, I am queer now and like, thank you. And so I name all this to say too, like, just like we like, we have the parable in the Bible about like throwing seeds onto fertile ground. I think deconstruction work is the same thing. It's like we are throwing seeds at people. And just because they're not responsive that year doesn't mean 3 years later or 5 years later, they'll say, thank you for introducing me to this new construction. So I want to say, as you talk to your family members and loved ones to try to help them see a new way, they might be super defensive, but they could be like me and they come back years later and they say, thank you for showing me a new way to think and be, because I couldn't receive it then, but I can receive it now. So please remember it's slow going work. And I myself am a product of people who planted seeds and allowed them time to root into me,
I also wanted to say I love your mentality on like people like me, like secular people who are just seeing the ugliest sides of church and going like, we need to just burn these to the ground. Like, and you explained really succinctly that obviously, like there's lots of people who don't want that, even if they maybe want to have some willingness to open their minds a little bit. They like the church community. That's something that you found, right? That in your life, you kind of stepped away from all of it and you kind of like missed that community. And that might be a thing that would be helpful for people too, to be like, you don't have to like become an atheist to care about people.
Yes, absolutely. Like no one is asking you to leave your faith. We're just asking you to re-examine the parts that are literally harmful. And something I say all the time to people is, if your faith requires the exclusion of another, you should examine that. You should ask why, if God is omnipotent and omniscient, omnipresent, would this God need to hate people to maintain its sense of power? Like, what about that sounds theologically sound or spiritually sound to you? And something I say to people all the time is, you're telling me that this God created earth within Christianity in 7 days, but like queerness is threatening, like sexuality is threatening. Like, how does that even, these things don't even feel like they make theological sense or sense at all. And so, and even when I like realized I was queer, the first person I called in my life was my sister. And she was like, why do you believe in a God that's so small that you would have to fissure yourself to belong? Like, why is this God so tiny? And so I think also asking people like, really, why would this matter to a God that is all-knowing? And if all people are products of God, how could there be part of humanity that is not of God? And what does that mean when we're saying like these people have things that are inherently part of them that are demonic and no one else does? Like, I just think when we really break down these ideologies, we kind of understand that part of them is our own human understanding of them. And within Christianity, we say something like something I say to people all the time is we've always had competing claims to God. It's just been the community that's closest to systemic power gets to claim truth. Like slavery, Black theology and white theology were competing in slavery. Black people were saying God ordains my freedom. White people were saying God ordains your enslavement. That's two communities with competing claims to God, saying both these claims are true when these claims are diametrically opposed. So we've always been in the process of making and remaking God. But when we only assign truth when I think it maintains someone's systemic power, that's when we say that's true, and I think that's interesting.
Yeah, man. No, that's deep. It really is. It's great. It's just stuff to think about, and just it makes so much sense. And I hope that these conversations can kind of get people to see that mind frame and just, understand that maybe what you're calling God might just be some guy who wants your money, and like God can exist outside of that. And
also living life with joy, that you're not suffering. That you made a point earlier about, being the person that God created you as is sort of like finding God also. So then people who are suffering and down and they can look to you and say, wow, this person is really living life and like light, walking in the light of God.
Ooh, I love that. I love that. One of my favorite quotes from Alice Walker is, every time I've met God in church, it's because everyone brought God in with them. And that's always been my idea of God as well, is like, like God, like for me, like God exists in the space because the three of us are talking and engaging and connecting. Like to me, that is a form of God. That's an experience of God. And I appreciated what you also both said kind of about it can be harder for secular people to understand maybe why some folks want to come stay in the church. And for me, like it's always been a mental health thing. Like when I walked away from God, like when I walked away from faith, I just felt like the weight of everyday decisions without feeling like some divine being is also working in my favor felt really sad. And I've always been really inspired by my friends who have walked away from faith and stayed away from faith. I've assigned a lot of power to that because I'm like, wow, like that's such a trust of self, such a trust of yourself to make your own good decisions, a trust of yourself to manage your life. I've found that it could just be my wiring. I always feel a little less anxiety if I feel like I'm in relationship with some type of spiritual being, which is why I say, religion is a social determinant of health for some of us. And that's why it's important. I think I always tell people in my deconstruction workshops, like, I'm not invested in you staying in faith. I want to be a conduit so you can ask the questions you need safely. And if that brings you back to faith, beautiful. If you leave it, that's beautiful. But I always want to create that option for people to return to some sort of spirituality if they're like me and they feel just discombobulated without some sort of North Star in their life,
Totally. Even as somebody like myself who I wouldn't call myself an atheist, but I'm secular. Like I also need that too. Like I meditate, I dance, like I'm a dancer. That is like, that's church to me. And I feel connected. And like you say, gardening and being in nature, that to me feels like what God might be. So absolutely. I love that you are working towards keeping if people want to keep their faith, to be like, yeah, that's great. Let's talk about maybe some of the harmful aspects of it. And then you can just keep doing it. It's great. It's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people are taught, like, if you engage in Christianity that's different than your pastor said it, like you've probably heard this because you grew up Southern Baptist, like it's a lukewarm theology, or you're cherry picking your faith, or you're making it up. And something I always look to is actually like something I think that was really interesting is during enslavement, enslaved Black people wouldn't read any books written by Paul in the Bible because these books were used to like affirm their slavery and enslavement. So they're like, we're going to read around these texts. And I name that to say there are always ways people have engaged with biblical text or sacred text in a way that works and affirms their own humanity. And they've kind of constructed and engaged with the text in a way that feels good for them. And so again, I think I always go back to history because right now I think something that Christian nationalism does and fundamentalism is it's very ahistorical. Like it makes it seem like the theology that exists now or how we talk about God now has always exists. Right. But I always looked at history to say it's always been changing. God has always been in flux with our own society, our own social cultural norms. And so I like to remind people when you're told you're cherry picking theology, everyone is doing that all the time, actually. We're all translating God all the time. No one is uniquely doing it. Your pastor's doing it on Sunday. I've heard many pastors preach the same biblical verses in a different way. In church, we call that exegesis. There's different exegesis of a million different verses. So I try to remind people when you're told something in the present, look at the precedent theologically, what's happened historically, because that helps me remember, like, I'm only doing what my ancestors have always done, which is engage with a God that is safe for them in a world that's constructed a God that's been deeply unsafe for marginalized peoples.
Yeah, this has been so wonderful. Where can people find you on the internet?
Yes, well, one, I want to say thank you all so much for having me. I think the work you do is so profound and amazing.
Oh
And
my gosh.
I have a lot of friends when I was at Harvard Divinity who are studying Mormonism. I have one friend who does amazing work as a Black Mormon woman. So I actually want to send you her work.
Please, I
I
would
think
love
you all
it.
would have a really great conversation. And so
Yes.
thank you for teaching me more about Mormonism. And maybe I'll make some videos about the connections, what we talked about today, because that
Love
was
that.
awesome. So just
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. You're really saving lives. And it's
Oh
really
my
an honor to
God,
meet you.
please. Oh,
Thank
No,
you.
genuinely,
Gosh.
it's true. I mean, 10 years ago, if I had something like this, it would have saved me a lot of praying away the gay and stuff. So, it's very important. So folks can find me on TikTok. Well, if TikTok, hopefully it doesn't go away.
we'll
We can
see.
find me on TikTok at the Gardening Theologian. And I'm moving a lot of my work over to Instagram in preparation for a possible TikTok shutdown at the Gardening Theologian. And I also do work on Substack. So if you go to my TikTok or Instagram, you can find my link tree and follow me on my newsletters. I have a deconstruction newsletter and a workplace corporate inclusion newsletter. And if you follow me, I do a lot of independent workshops. So you can come to one of those. And I'll also be launching a Patreon in January, which I'm so excited about. So hopefully you all can join and hang out with me. Hopefully I can have you all on my Patreon. So
Love to.
those are a few ways you can stay connected with me.
Cool. All right. Yeah, you're such a badass. So thank you so much for all of your thoughts. It's so helpful.
Oh my gosh, yeah, thank you. It was so fun to be in conversation today. And I'm actually working on, if my agent doesn't kill me because I never get her any writing, but I'm supposed to be working on my book proposal around theology and all these other things. So you all gave me some things to think about for some of my chapter summaries. So thank you, thank you.
Oh, I can't wait to read your book.
Love it.
I got to get it done. So
All right.
keep me accountable. Your audience can keep me accountable. I got to get it done.
All right.
Love it. Well, have a good day. Good luck with everything.
Man, yeah.
Thank you.